If you've started your journey with Azure Purview or Apache Atlas, you'll notice that oftentimes you'll have to create something custom in order to fit a data source or a tool that you want to keep track of in your metadata repository. As a result, you have to dive into custom types. In this video, we're going to show you how to do custom types with Excel and PyApacheAtlas, so you don't have to write a lot of code in order to actually get custom types created and be able to use them as soon as possible. Our agenda is quickly we're going to create a template to be used for PyApacheAtlas. This will allow us to have a standard way of defining a custom type, and then we can quickly, using the PyApacheAtlas package, extract the data from that template and then push it into Azure Purview. Also, we'll quickly go over the type system in Purview and Atlas, just because you have at least a decent understanding of what's going on and how the system kind of works. And then we will go into creating a simple dataset entity type, meaning we'll create a custom entity based off of the dataset. And then we'll also create a custom process entity type that'll be very useful, let's say, for doing column mapping that you may be interested in for Azure Purview. And we'll see even more about that in a later video as well. If you want to find out more, you can check out these links below, checking out on Data Smackdown or on GitHub for additional links and resources for you to explore custom type development. So first, we need to create the template. I'm assuming you've already installed PyApacheAtlas. If not, please check out the video on how to install and authenticate against Azure Purview and Apache Atlas. But I'm going to assume you've done this already, and let's go to VS Code and actually run this command and create the actual Excel template. So here I am in VS Code, and this is my development environment that I like to use, and I've already got PyApacheAtlas installed. So I'm just going to run the command. Great. I have now created the template. Now that we've created the template, let's discuss what an actual type system looks like inside of Azure Purview and Apache Atlas. Technically, it's the Apache Atlas type system, and Azure Purview is using Apache Atlas under the hood. So we're going to look at it from the perspective of essentially a hierarchical system. If you're very familiar with programming languages and object-oriented programming languages specifically, you will see this as inheritance. For those of you who are not familiar with inheritance and object-oriented programming languages, just imagine that you have a parent-child relationship between these so-called types. And each type is like a contract. It tells you what the system should expect, right? If, for example, I have an Azure SQL DB, the type itself contains a list of attributes. And so an Azure SQL DB has a principal ID, it has a last modified time, it has a couple other attributes that are attached to it. So whenever I create an Azure SQL DB in Purview or in Atlas, I have a set of attributes that I can record against. With that being said, I can also, go back up even further up the chain, right? An Azure SQL DB actually is not created by itself in isolation. It references an Azure resource. The Azure resource type is essentially the super type or the parent type of an Azure SQL DB. So all of the attributes that an Azure resource has, that is going to be inherited by the Azure SQL DB. An Azure resource has things like the resource ID. It has, I believe, things like resource group in there as well, subscription ID. So it has more things specific to Azure. And an Azure SQL DB, it very much has those attributes, right? It has a resource ID. However, if you look at something like an Azure SQL table, a table doesn't have a resource ID. It is a data object inside of an Azure SQL DB, or more specifically, an Azure SQL schema. And so it does not inherit from an Azure resource, and thus it does not have attributes like an Azure SQL table does not have attributes like resource ID, resource group. Instead, you would rely on some sort of relationship between a table and its database in order to find that kind of information. However, in isolation, an Azure SQL table inherits from the dataset type. And the dataset type is one of the most common types you'll see. It represents almost all table and column sort of relationships, or rather table and column entity types. And so this is the most common super type that you will use, and what PyApacheAtlas's template defaults to. Another very common type is the process type. and the process type is used in custom lineage. There's another video about custom lineage that you can view and some documentation about it on Purview, on Apache Atlas, in PyApacheAtlas as well. So, but in short, the process type is also out there, and it then has its own inputs and outputs attributes that other processes like Hive process and the Azure Data Factory process will inherit. They need to have these things in order to have lineage for Hive, to have lineage for Azure Data Factory. In this case, you'll note that all three are coming from the asset type. And so the asset type is one of the root types in Apache Atlas and Azure Purview, and it defines things like, hey, anything that is an asset is going to have a description, it's going to have a qualified name, and it's going to have a friendly name as well. And so we can see then that all Azure resources, all datasets, all processes, they all have those three things because they all inherit from an asset type. For the most part, you don't need to go much beyond the dataset and the process type. If you're going to get more advanced, you absolutely can. However, I would strongly encourage you to stick with dataset and process as your super types until you get into more complex scenarios. Now that we have an understanding of the actual type system, we can create a very simple dataset entity type. And again, we will by default have a dataset because that's what PyApacheAtlas assumes you're going to want to create, because that's the most common. So let's go into the template and actually explore the template and set up our very first one. This Excel template provides us with an entity defs tab. On this tab, each row represents an attribute that you want to add to a new or existing entity type. And so what we'll have to do on each row is provide the type name, then we'll provide the name of the attribute, and then there's a whole bunch of technically optional features in here as well. So let's just go through a quick example. Let's say I wanted to create something like something silly like my custom type. That's the name of the type that I will be creating. And then I'll have an attribute, and I'll call this last known author. Let's just say I want to do something like that. I'm going to say this is an author, different than an expert, different than an owner, it's an author. I would add some sort of optional description, and I would say something like this is an author and should be an email address maybe. And then from here on out, if I was using a string attribute, I could leave everything else blank at this point. By default, this is a string attribute that is being added. If I had more complex requirements here, like for example, if I wanted to make this to be a required field, this column is optional. I could set this to false. And it's like just an Excel false, right? And so this would make it a required field. There's some attributes here that are more specific to to Apache Atlas, but some of them do apply to Azure Purview as well. So for example, a default value. I could set this as a default value, and I could make this as nobody@contoso.com. In addition, I might want to perhaps give it more, a type itself. I could explicitly state that this is going to be a string type. If I go further, I could also have made this into something like an array of a string. And so this would allow it to have multiple values. And so then values min count and values max count, as well as cardinality, all come into play here. Cardinality would have to be a set because it is a set of attributes or set of values. The values min count might be 0. I could get away with 0. And the max, maybe I'm only allowed to have 5 last known authors. These other attributes are specific to Apache Atlas and are not relevant for Azure Purview, but if you wanted to use them, you absolutely could. They're more so for some of the Kafka components as well as the searching ability inside of here. Again, those are not related to Azure Purview, only Apache Atlas, and I'll defer to the Apache Atlas documentation for more purposeful setting of these. So we saw a string, maybe this would be an integer perhaps. You can also do, there's a small array of different types that you can choose to of primitives, which I will provide a link in the description as well. So ultimately, I might do maybe something like file size, perhaps, right? And this is the size of the files, and this I can leave is optional blank because this is by default, everything is optional. And then maybe I'm saying again it's an int, right? And so I just assume that if this file says, I'm going to record the number of bytes that are being there. And so great, I would repeat this, and I would also of course include, I'd have to repeat the word my custom type multiple times, and this would be defining a very simple attribute. Now that we've created a dataset entity type, again using the default values for in PyApacheAtlas, let's see how we would create a process entity type. Coming back to our Excel spreadsheet, we're still in the Entity Defs tab. I've left up the information from our custom dataset, and I'm going to actually add in another type here in the same spreadsheet to demonstrate that we don't need to actually care about keeping this one-to-one mapping between Entity Defs and the spreadsheet. You can define dozens, maybe even 100 different types if you wanted to inside of one tab on the spreadsheet, and PyApacheAtlas will just take it all out and push it into Azure Purview or Apache Atlas for you. So let's create our custom process type now. And as quickly as that, I've created a custom process type. I've just filled in the Excel spreadsheet with this new information. So 2 new rows listing out a custom process type as my type name, very unoriginal. I've then created a column mapping attribute, and this is actually, as the description says, supports our concept of column mapping in Azure Purview. And this is kind of like column level lineage for the most part in the process entity. So we'll see this in another video as well to demonstrate this even more so, but as an example, it's a useful one to include in any of your custom process types because you may want to use it later on. And then in addition, I'm just going to create another attribute, another string attribute, and this is going to be called transformations. And if you've ever looked at like a data factory copy activity or data factory data flow, there's a domain specific language that it is using, and in Purview, it'll just extract that domain specific language and then dump it into Purview's metadata. So I'd like to support that too, perhaps, and I'll include that as an attribute here. So those are my 2 rows, but I also added an additional column, this entity super types column, and I filled it in with process. And so this is where if I was doing any inheritance or overriding the default value of dataset, I would need to specify it here. I would need to add this column to the template, and then I would need to fill it in. And so great, now that I have this created, I'm going to go ahead and save this. And let's actually run this in VS Code and extract the information and see what we get. In VS Code, I've already created a demo script, and this is also available on GitHub as well for you to explore. So in this demo script, I'm just doing some of the basic steps. I am first, importing the JSON library to parse the contents that we receive back. I'm using the Azure Identity library so that way I can log in with my Azure CLI credentials, and I don't need to have a service principal in this case. And then I'm going to bring out the Purview client, and so that I can authenticate and so that I can actually push stuff to Purview. And then I have to, since I'm using the Excel functionality, I have to extract or import the Excel configuration and Excel reader from the readers module in PyApacheAtlas. And then I'm going to start it up. I'm going to create a default configuration. And so this is, as the template is made, it's the defaults, so it should work perfectly fine. And then I'll create a reader, and I'm going to pass in the configuration here. Now that I've created that reader, I can use the reader methods like parse entity defs, and I can point it to my file path of demo.xlsx. Once I've got that content, it'll be stored in the types variable, and then I'm just going to do an upload. I'm going to upload that content, and I'm going to upload it as upload type defs. And then I've also specified this parameter, an argument of force update true. So what this does is if I have an existing type, it will attempt to do an update. It'll query for all the types I'm about to push against, and then it will say, yep, okay, this does indeed exist, okay, do an update against it. Word of caution is that if you happen to be doing an update and it's a required field, there may be you may receive an error if you don't specify a default value. So just be aware. And also in Apache Atlas, I'm not sure, but in Azure Purview, you cannot change the built-in system types, right? So anything that the Azure Purview team has provided you, you are not allowed to change. So you won't be able to do a force update on those. It's only on the type that you define in Azure Purview at least. So great, once we get the results, I'm just gonna print it out so we can see what happens here. So let's give it a run. I'm just gonna run Python demo.py with my Excel spreadsheet saved, and let's see what we get. Great, so it just printed out everything. I'm just gonna scroll up to the top just to see more information about what we got. Essentially what we received here is that the results of it is the current state of these particular types, right? So here are my entity defs that were created, and so I see all this new information about this, right? It has GUIDs assigned to it. It has all the attributes that I created in there. It has the default relationship attributes that are done. And so great, this means I am successful. I've now created this particular entity and this particular process type. So what can I do now? Now that I've done this, I'll link to it in the other video, but you can use the bulk entity uploads and you can start using these custom types. So let's just take a quick snippet at the bulk entities tab, and we can see what this might look like. As a silly example, here's what a bulk entities tab might look like. I'm not going to go through the demo code because again, that's another video, but in this case, I'm going to start using those custom types that I created. And again, they were called my custom type and custom process type. Very unoriginal, be better than this. But this is what it would look like. I would, start plugging it in as the type name. I provide the friendly name. I provide a unique qualified name. And then I can start immediately using those variables, right? I can plug in my last known author. I can plug in my file size. I can plug in my transformations. And then I can just effectively upload this, run the Python code to upload this. And I'm immediately able to use this now that we've created it on the Entity Defs tab and executed it with PyApacheAtlas as well. With that, thank you so much for watching this video on how to create custom types with Excel and PyApacheAtlas. Hopefully you can start quickly using this in creating your custom data sets as well as custom process types so that you can create representations of on-prem data sources and tools that don't have built-in types or built-in connectors already in Azure Purview or Apache Atlas. I'm looking forward to hearing about your success with this package, and so please feel free to reach out on GitHub with any issues or comments. I really love receiving that feedback and hearing about your usage in the community. Thank you so much.